Sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the most extraordinary secrets. Margaret Chen thought she was just another tired nurse finishing another long shift at Walter Reed Medical Center. She had no idea that her name was written in classified files, spoken in hushed tones in the Pentagon, and that her final walk to the parking garage would change everything she thought she knew about her own life. What happens when the people you've spent years caring for turn out to be the very ones who've been protecting a secret that could rewrite your entire existence? Some stories begin with an ending, and Margaret's was about to discover that her last day as a nurse was actually the first day of a truth she never saw coming. Margaret Chen pulled her tired feet across the polished hospital floor for what she knew would be the last time. After 32 years of nursing at Walter Reed Medical Center, her final shift was ending not with fanfare or celebration, but with the same quiet exhaustion that had marked thousands of nights before. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she made her way down the familiar corridors, past rooms where she had witnessed both miracles and heartbreak. At 61, Margaret had decided it was time to retire. Her back ached constantly from years of lifting patients. Her hands were permanently stained from countless medical procedures, and her heart carried the weight of every soldier she couldn't save. She had served during conflicts most people only read about in history books. Desert Storm, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and dozens of smaller operations that never made the evening news. Each war had brought a new wave of broken young men and women to her care. The specialized wing, where Margaret worked, was different from the regular hospital floors. This section housed active duty military personnel with highly classified injuries. Soldiers who couldn't be treated at regular facilities, whose very presence at Walter Reed was considered sensitive information. Margaret had learned long ago not to ask too many questions about how these patients had been wounded or where their missions had taken them. Her job was to heal, not to investigate. As she walked past room 247, she paused. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison was sleeping, his left leg elevated and wrapped in fresh bandages. She had been caring for him for 3 weeks since his arrival from what his file simply listed as overseas operations. Like so many others, his injuries told a story his mouth never would. Shrapnel wounds consistent with IED explosions, but the pattern was unusual. The metal fragments embedded in his leg were from a type of explosive device she had never encountered in her 3 decades of military nursing. Margaret gently adjusted his foredrip and checked his vitals one final time. Morrison stirred slightly, his eyes opening just enough to focus on her face. "Nurse Chun," he whispered, his voice hoarse from pain medication. "You're working late again." "Last shift, actually," Margaret replied softly, checking his chart. "I'm retiring tomorrow." Something changed in Morrison's expression. A flicker of concern crossed his face that had nothing to do with his physical pain. "Retiring? Where will you go?" "Home to my garden and my books," she said with a tired smile. "Maybe travel a little. I have a sister in Oregon I haven't seen in 5 years." Morrison's hand reached out and gently grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone who had been heavily medicated for weeks. "Nurse Chun, there are things you should know before you leave this place." Margaret had heard dying words and drug-induced confessions before, but something in Morrison's tone made her pay attention. His eyes were clear, not clouded by medication. This wasn't delirium or hallucination speaking. "What kind of things, James?" "The patients you've cared for over the years. Some of us weren't just regular military. Some of us were part of operations that—" He paused, glancing toward the door. "Operations that involved protecting certain individuals. Civilians who didn't know they were being protected." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "I don't understand. The car accident you were in 15 years ago. The one where you walked away without a scratch while the other driver died. That wasn't an accident, Margaret. That was an assassination attempt that we stopped." The room seemed to spin slightly around Margaret. She remembered that night clearly. She had been driving home from a double shift when another car ran a red light and slammed into her passenger side. The other driver had been killed instantly, but Somehow her old Honda had absorbed the impact in a way that defied physics. The investigating officers had called it a miracle. "That's impossible," she whispered. Morrison's grip tightened. "The brake lines on your car had been cut. Someone wanted you dead that night. We replaced your car with an identical one, but armored. The man who hit you wasn't drunk like the police report said. He was hired to make sure you never made it home." Margaret pulled her hand away, stepping back from the bed. "Why would anyone want to kill a nurse? This doesn't make sense." "Because you're not just any nurse, Margaret. You've been caring for operators from the most classified military units in the country for over 3 decades. You've seen faces, heard names, witnessed injuries that could compromise national security if they fell into the wrong hands. But more than that," Morrison paused, struggling with whether to continue. "More than what? Your father. The man you think was your father. David Chen wasn't a simple immigrant who worked in a restaurant kitchen. He was a Chinese-American intelligence officer who defected to the United States in 1962 with information that changed the course of the Cold War. When he married your mother and started a family, he didn't just disappear into civilian life. He was given a new identity, a new job, and protection for his family. That protection extended to you." Margaret felt her legs give out slightly, and she grabbed the edge of Morrison's bed for support. Her father had died when she was 12, and she had always been told he was simply a hard-working immigrant who had never talked much about his life in China. The stories she had been told about his past were vague and inconsistent, but she had never questioned them. "That's why you were steered toward nursing school," Morrison continued. "That's why you ended up at Walter Reed specifically. That's why you've been given security clearances that most nurses never receive. You've been under protection your entire adult life, and you never knew it." The corridor outside Morrison's room was silent except for the distant hum of medical equipment. Margaret's mind raced through memories, looking for signs she might have missed. The scholarship to nursing school that appeared out of nowhere when her family couldn't afford tuition. The way her job applications to other hospitals were always mysteriously rejected, while Walter Reed welcomed her immediately. The apartment she rented in a building where several other tenants seemed to work unusual hours and never talked about their jobs. "Who else knows about this?" she asked. "Every patient in this wing. Every soldier you've cared for here has been briefed about your situation. We've all been part of keeping you safe while you kept us alive." Margaret thought about the hundreds of soldiers she had treated over the years. The way they looked at her, sometimes with what she had interpreted as gratitude, but now realized might have been something closer to respect mixed with protectiveness. The unusual number of patients who had kept in touch with her after their recovery, sending Christmas cards and photos of their families year after year. "The night shift supervisor position you were offered 5 years ago," Morrison said. "You turned it down because you preferred working directly with patients. That position would have moved you to a different wing, away from classified cases. When you declined, certain people in very high places were relieved. Certain people, the kind of people who don't exist on organizational charts, but make decisions that affect national security. The kind of people who have been watching over you since you were a child." Margaret remembered the job offer clearly. The promotion would have meant more money and regular hours, but something had made her hesitate. She had told herself it was because she preferred hands-on patient care, but now she wondered if some unconscious instinct had guided her decision. Morrison reached for his water cup, and Margaret automatically helped him drink. Even in the middle of having her world turned upside down, her nursing instincts remained intact. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because your protection doesn't end when you retire. But the nature of it has to change. For 32 years, keeping you safe meant keeping you here in a controlled environment where every person around you was vetted and every situation was monitored. Once you leave Walter Reed, that level of control becomes impossible." Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the parking garage where her car was waiting. The same parking garage she had used for decades, where security guards always seemed to be present even during the quietest overnight shifts. The same parking garage where her car had never been vandalized despite being in a high-crime area of the city. "There's more," Morrison said behind her. "Your retirement isn't just the end of your nursing career. It's the end of a chapter of national security that has lasted for over half a century. The intelligence your father provided is still classified, still relevant to current operations. There are people in other countries who would still consider his family a valuable target. But he's been dead for 49 years. Intelligence doesn't have an expiration date. The information he provided led to successful operations that are still ongoing today. Some of those operations have made powerful enemies who have very long memories. Margaret turned back to face Morrison. In the dim light of the room, she could see that he wasn't just a wounded soldier anymore. There was something in his posture, his expression, that suggested training that went far beyond regular military service. What kind of operations? The kind that prevent wars before they start. The kind that save thousands of lives by eliminating threats before they become active. Your father's intelligence helped identify sleeper agents who had infiltrated the United States government, military contractors who were selling weapons to enemy nations, and foreign nationals who were planning terrorist attacks on American soil. Margaret sat down heavily in the chair beside Morrison's bed. The comfortable world she had built for herself over 61 years was crumbling with each revelation. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, and her career was apparently a carefully constructed fiction. "How many people have died protecting me?" she asked quietly. Morrison was silent for a long moment. "The driver who hit you 15 years ago was killed by a sniper before he could finish the job and escape. 3 other assassination attempts were stopped before they reached the execution phase. 2 foreign intelligence operatives who had identified you as a target were arrested and quietly deported. A bombing attempt on your apartment building was prevented when suspicious packages were intercepted. A bombing. Your apartment building houses 4 other individuals who require protection for various classified reasons. The bombing would have eliminated all of you at once, while making it look like a gas leak explosion." Margaret thought about her neighbors. Mrs. Patterson in 3B, who claimed to be a retired schoolteacher, but received mail from government agencies Margaret had never heard of. The young couple in 2A, who said they worked in computer programming, but kept schedules that suggested they were rarely home for more than a few days at a time. The elderly man in 4C, who walked with a cane, but moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years in combat. "How long have you known about my situation?" she asked Morrison. "Since before I was wounded. My unit was briefed about your protection detail as part of our mission preparation. We were told that maintaining the security of certain assets was as important as completing our primary objectives." Assets. People whose knowledge, skills, or family history makes them valuable to ongoing national security operations. You qualify in all 3 categories. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what Morrison was telling her. She had spent her entire adult life believing she was simply a nurse who happened to work with military patients. The idea that she was part of a complex web of national security operations was almost impossible to accept. Morrison reached for his phone, which was charging on his bedside table. "There's someone you need to meet before you leave tonight. I don't think I can handle any more revelations right now." "This one isn't a revelation. It's an introduction to your future." Before Margaret could protest, Morrison had sent a text message. Within minutes, Margaret heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Not the soft rubber soles of medical staff, but the firm, measured steps of military boots. The man who entered Morrison's room was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the controlled precision of elite military training. He wore civilian clothes, but everything about his posture and bearing suggested someone accustomed to command. His eyes scanned the room quickly, assessing potential threats before focusing on Margaret. "Nurse Chun," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "My name is Commander David Torres. I believe Lieutenant Commander Morrison has begun explaining your situation." Margaret studied Torres's face. Like Morrison, there was something about him that went beyond regular military service. His eyes held the kind of awareness that came from years of operating in dangerous environments where a moment's inattention could mean death. "Commander Torres has been coordinating your protection detail for the past 7 years," Morrison explained. "He's here to discuss your transition to civilian protection." Torres pulled up a second chair and sat down facing Margaret. What Morrison has told you is just the beginning. Your retirement from Walter Reed doesn't end your connection to national security operations. It changes it. I just want to go home and tend my garden, Margaret said weakly. And you will. But your home will be relocating to a place where we can ensure your continued safety while allowing you to live a normal civilian life. What kind of place? A retirement community in Arizona that specializes in housing former military personnel and their families. Beautiful location, excellent medical facilities, and security that doesn't look like security. Margaret felt a surge of anger cutting through her confusion. You're talking about moving me to some kind of military nursing home? I'm talking about moving you to a place where you can have the retirement you've earned while remaining safe from threats you never knew existed, Torres replied calmly. The community I'm describing includes former officers, intelligence personnel, military contractors, and family members of people whose service requires ongoing protection. It's not a nursing home. It's a town. Green Valley Estates. 3,000 residents, most of whom are retired military or intelligence personnel. Shopping centers, restaurants, recreational facilities, medical clinic, library, community center. Everything you would find in any retirement community, except every resident has signed security agreements and understands the importance of operational security. Margaret looked between Morrison and Torres. And if I refuse, then we work with you to develop an alternative security plan that allows you to live wherever you choose, Torres said. But I should be honest with you about the challenges that would involve. What kind of challenges? The kind where armed security personnel would need to be present in your life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Where every person you interact with would need to be background checked. Where your movements would need to be tracked and your communications monitored. Where your independence would be severely limited for the sake of your safety. Margaret realized she was facing a choice between two different types of captivity. One that looked like freedom but was carefully controlled, and another that was honestly restrictive but openly acknowledged as protection. How long do I have to decide? You don't leave this hospital until we have a security plan in place, Torres said. That could be tomorrow if you agree to Green Valley Estates. It could be several weeks if we need to arrange alternative protection. Margaret stood up and walked back to the window. The parking garage below looked different now that she knew it was monitored by security personnel she had never noticed. Everything in her life looked different now that she understood the hidden layers of protection that had surrounded her for decades. Can I think about it overnight? Of course. But I should mention that there are some people at Green Valley Estates who are very much looking forward to meeting you. What kind of people? Torres smiled for the first time since entering the room. Other nurses who have cared for classified military personnel. A few doctors who have performed surgery on operators whose missions officially never happened. Some former intelligence officers who worked with your father decades ago. Margaret felt a spark of curiosity cutting through her fear and confusion. The idea of meeting people who had known her father in his real capacity, who could tell her about the man he had actually been rather than the fiction she had been raised with, was compelling. Would I be allowed to leave Green Valley Estates? Travel? Visit my sister in Oregon? With appropriate security arrangements? Yes. The goal isn't to imprison you, Margaret. It's to allow you to live safely. Margaret looked at Morrison, who was watching her with an expression of concern mixed with understanding. All those years of caring for patients like you, and I never knew I was part of the same world you inhabited. You've always been part of our world, Morrison replied. You just didn't know it. Every life you saved, every comfort you provided to wounded operators, every secret you kept without even knowing they were secrets. All of that has been service to your country as real as anything we did in the field. Torres stood up, preparing to leave. I'll be back tomorrow morning to discuss the details of whichever option you choose. In the meantime, I want you to know that everyone involved in your protection considers it an honor to serve someone who has served so many others. After Torres left, Margaret remained in Morrison's room for another hour, asking questions about her father, her childhood, and the signs she had missed throughout her life. Morrison answered what he could, but made it clear that much of the information about her father's intelligence work remained classified, even from him. As Margaret finally prepared to leave the hospital, Morrison caught her hand one more time. "Whatever you decide about your future, I want you to know something. Every soldier you've cared for in this wing has gone back into the field knowing that if we were wounded again, we might be fortunate enough to have you caring for us. The kind of trust is rarer than you might think." Margaret squeezed his hand gently. "Get some rest, James. And thank you for telling me the truth." Walking through the hospital corridors toward the parking garage, Margaret noticed details she had overlooked for years. Security cameras positioned at intervals that provided complete coverage of every area. Staff members whose ID badges had subtle markings she had never paid attention to. Patients who moved through the halls with a controlled awareness of people trained to assess threats. As she reached her car, a security guard she had seen hundreds of times over the years approached her. "Good evening, Nurse Chun. Drive safely tonight." For the first time, Margaret really looked at the man speaking to her. He was older than she had thought, probably in his 60s, with the bearing of former military. His uniform appeared standard, but his equipment belt carried items that seemed more advanced than typical hospital security. "Thank you, Officer Reynolds, Mom. Been watching over this parking garage for 12 years now." "Watching over the parking garage, or watching over me?" Reynolds smiled slightly. "Both, ma'am, both." As Margaret drove home through the familiar streets of Washington, D.C., she found herself looking for the protection she now knew surrounded her. Were the cars following at a consistent distance part of her security detail? Was the man walking his dog across the street from her apartment building positioned there deliberately? How many of her daily interactions over the past 3 decades had been with people whose real job was keeping her safe? Back in her apartment, Margaret made a cup of tea and sat in her favorite chair, trying to process everything she had learned. On her coffee table was a stack of mail that had arrived that day, and for the first time in her life, she found herself studying the return addresses with suspicion. Bills from companies she had been using for years, a magazine subscription she didn't remember ordering, a letter from her sister in Oregon. She opened the letter from her sister first. The handwriting was definitely familiar, and the content was typical family news. But as she read about her sister's grandchildren and retirement plans, Margaret found herself wondering if even this correspondence was monitored by people whose job was to ensure that nothing in her personal life posed a security risk. Margaret went to her bedroom and pulled out a box of photos she kept in her closet. Pictures of her parents, her childhood, her nursing school graduation, colleagues from the hospital. She had always treasured these photos as evidence of a simple, honest life well lived. Now she studied them, looking for clues about the hidden complexity that had surrounded her from birth. In one photo from her nursing school graduation, she noticed something she had never paid attention to before. Several people in the background who weren't part of the ceremony, positioned around the edges of the crowd with the kind of alertness that suggested they were watching for potential threats rather than celebrating academic achievement. Another photo from a hospital Christmas party 5 years earlier showed her surrounded by colleagues and patients. But looking closely, she could now identify which faces belonged to people whose jobs involved classified military operations. The way they held themselves, the way their eyes scanned their surroundings, even in a social setting, the subtle deference other people showed them without quite realizing why. Margaret set the photos aside and walked to her kitchen window, which overlooked the street below. She had always enjoyed this view, watching the quiet neighborhood settle into evening routines. Now she found herself studying the scene with new awareness. The man working late in the office building across the street was positioned where he could observe her apartment. The woman walking her dog past the building twice each evening followed a route that provided visual coverage of all entrances. As she prepared for bed, Margaret realized that tomorrow would bring not just the end of her nursing career, but the beginning of a life where she understood the true nature of the world she had always inhabited. Whether she chose the controlled freedom of Green Valley Estates or the openly restrictive alternative security plan, nothing would ever be the same. She fell asleep, wondering who her father had really been, and what secrets he had carried that were valuable enough to protect his daughter for over 6 decades after his death. Tomorrow, she would begin learning the answers to questions she had never known she needed to ask. Margaret woke before dawn with a strange sensation that she had dreamed her entire previous evening, but the business card on her nightstand proved otherwise. Commander David Torres, United States Navy Special Operations, with a phone number she was supposed to call before leaving her apartment that morning. The simple piece of white cardstock represented the end of a life built on comfortable ignorance and the beginning of something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She made coffee using the same routine she had followed for 20 years, but everything felt different. The sound of footsteps in a hallway above her apartment, which she had always attributed to her upstairs neighbor getting ready for work, now seemed deliberately timed. The delivery truck that parked across the street every morning might not be making legitimate deliveries. Even her morning newspaper, which she had subscribed to for 15 years, could be part of an elaborate system designed to monitor what information reached her. Margaret called the number on Torres's card at exactly 8 o'clock. He answered before the first ring finished. "Good morning, Margaret. How did you sleep?" Like someone whose entire understanding of reality was destroyed 12 hours ago. She replied honestly. "That's understandable. Are you ready to learn more about your options?" "Do I have a choice?" "You always have choices. But some choices come with consequences that are easier to live with than others." Torres arrived at her apartment an hour later, accompanied by a woman Margaret didn't recognize. The woman was probably in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of competent professional appearance Margaret associated with hospital administrators. But like Torres and Morrison, there was something about her bearing that suggested capabilities beyond her civilian appearance. "Margaret, this is Dr. Sarah Wellington. She's a physician who has worked with classified military medical programs for 25 years. She's also a resident of Green Valley Estates." Dr. Wellington shook Margaret's hand warmly. "I've heard wonderful things about your work at Walter Reed. Several patients you cared for are now colleagues of mine in Arizona." Colleagues. Green Valley Estates isn't a retirement community in the traditional sense, Dr. Wellington explained as they sat down in Margaret's living room. Many residents continue working in consulting roles for government agencies, defense contractors, and intelligence organizations. The difference is that we work from a secure location where our expertise can be utilized without compromising our safety. Margaret poured coffee for her unexpected guests, noting that both Torres and Dr. Wellington automatically positioned themselves where they could see both the apartment's entrance and its windows. Professional habits that came from years of operating in environments where situational awareness meant survival. "What kind of consulting work?" Margaret asked. "Medical consulting for ongoing operations," Dr. Wellington replied. "Analysis of battlefield injuries to improve protective equipment. Review of medical protocols for special operations units. Training programs for military medical personnel who will be working with classified patients. The kind of work where experience matters more than physical stamina." Torres opened a briefcase and pulled out several folders. "Before we discuss your future in detail, there are things about your past that you need to understand. Information about your father that was classified when you were growing up but has been declassified for this conversation." Margaret felt her stomach tighten with anticipation. Everything Morrison had told her the night before had been shocking, but it had also been incomplete. The full truth about her father's life and death was apparently more complex than she had been prepared to hear. "Your father's real name was Chun Wei-Ming," Torres began, opening the first folder. "He was a major in Chinese military intelligence who specialized in analyzing Soviet military technology. In 1962, he was assigned to a joint Chinese-Soviet project developing new types of explosive devices for use against American forces in Vietnam." Margaret stared at a photograph that showed a man who looked like her father, but younger and wearing a military uniform she had never seen before. The resemblance was unmistakable, but the context was completely foreign to everything she had been told about his background. The project involved reverse engineering captured American equipment to identify weaknesses that could be exploited by enemy forces, Dr. Wellington continued. Your father was part of a team that analyzed everything from radio equipment to aircraft engines to medical devices used by American military hospitals. Medical devices? Including life support systems, surgical equipment, and pharmaceutical protocols used to treat wounded American soldiers, Torres confirmed. Your father had access to information that could have been used to develop chemical and biological weapons specifically designed to target American military medical facilities. Margaret felt sick. The idea that her father had been involved in developing weapons meant to kill American soldiers and medical personnel was almost impossible to process. But he defected to America. That means he chose our side, right? He did defect, but the reasons were more complex than simple political ideology, Torres replied. Your father discovered that the joint Chinese-Soviet project was not limited to military targets. The weapons being developed were intended for use against civilian hospitals, refugee camps, and medical facilities operated by humanitarian organizations. Dr. Wellington leaned forward. Your father was a soldier, but he was also a human being who had trained as a medic before becoming an intelligence officer. When he realized that his work was being used to develop weapons that would deliberately target doctors and nurses trying to save lives, he decided he couldn't continue. So he contacted American intelligence. Not immediately. First, he attempted to sabotage the project from within. For 6 months, he provided false data and corrupted research results, hoping to delay or derail the weapons development program. When Chinese security began investigating the problems with the project, your father realized he was running out of time. Torres opened another folder containing what appeared to be correspondence written in Chinese characters, along with English translations. These are letters your father wrote to his brother in Hong Kong during the months leading up to his defection. They were intercepted by British intelligence and shared with American agencies. Margaret looked at the translations of her father's letters. Even filtered through the formal language of intelligence documents, his moral struggle was clear. He wrote about nightmares involving hospitals full of wounded children, about the weight of knowledge that could be used to cause immense suffering, and about his growing certainty that some lines should never be crossed regardless of political loyalty. The night your father defected, he didn't just escape with his own life, Dr. Wellington explained. He destroyed 3 years of research data, killed 2 Chinese security officers who tried to stop him, and carried with him complete technical specifications for the weapons being developed. He killed people who would have killed him, and then continued developing weapons designed to target medical personnel, Torres said matter-of-factly. Your father understood that his defection was meaningless if the research continued without him. Margaret stood up and walked to her kitchen window, trying to process the image of her quiet, gentle father as someone capable of violence. The man she remembered had been soft-spoken, patient, and completely devoted to his family. The idea that he had killed people, even in self-defense or for moral reasons, challenged everything she thought she knew about his character. What happened after he reached American intelligence? He spent 2 years in debriefing sessions, providing every detail he could remember about Chinese and Soviet military capabilities, Torres replied. The information he provided led to the development of defensive measures that saved thousands of American lives during the Vietnam War and beyond. Dr. Wellington joined Margaret at the window, but providing that information also made him a permanent target. Chinese intelligence spent years trying to locate and eliminate your father. Soviet intelligence wanted him dead because his defection had compromised their joint operations with China. Even some American agencies considered him a security risk because of how much he knew about ongoing intelligence operations. That's why he was given a new identity and moved to a carefully monitored civilian life, Torres added. David Chun, restaurant worker and family man, was a fiction designed to protect Chen Weiming, former Chinese military intelligence officer and American intelligence asset. Margaret turned back to face her visitors. How did he die? The official story was a heart attack when I was 12. Torres, and Dr. Wellington exchanged a look that suggested this part of the story was particularly difficult to tell. Your father was assassinated by a Soviet intelligence operative who had spent 15 years tracking him down, Torres said quietly. The heart attack was a cover story designed to protect you and your mother from retaliation. Margaret sat down heavily in her kitchen chair. Assassinated? How? Poison delivered through a letter that was designed to look like correspondence from his brother in Hong Kong. Your father opened it at work, thinking it was family news. He died 3 hours later in a hospital emergency room, with doctors unable to identify what was wrong with him. We weren't even told he was in the hospital, Margaret whispered, remembering the day her mother had sat her down to explain that her father had died suddenly at work. Because bringing you to the hospital would have exposed you to potential surveillance by the same people who had killed your father, Dr. Wellington explained. Your mother was told that your father had asked that his family not see him in his final condition. That was a lie, but it was designed to keep you safe. Margaret felt tears starting to form, not just for her father's death, but for the decades of lies that had followed. Her mother had carried the burden of knowing the truth about her husband's murder while raising their daughter on fabricated stories about his peaceful passing. Did my mother know the truth about who my father really was? She knew some of it, Torres replied. She knew he had been involved in classified work before they met, and she knew that their family required protection because of his past. But she was never given the complete details about his intelligence background or the specific nature of the threats against your family. She died thinking she was protecting me by keeping his secrets. She died knowing she had successfully protected you by keeping his secrets, Dr. Wellington corrected gently. Your mother lived for 37 years after your father's death, and during that entire time, you were safe because she never revealed anything that could have compromised your security. Torres opened another folder. This is where your story becomes particularly important to current national security operations. The intelligence your father provided in 1962 is still relevant today. Some of the weapons technology he helped develop was never fully abandoned by Chinese or Russian intelligence agencies. Instead, it was modified and updated for use against modern American medical facilities. What does that mean? It means that terrorist organizations and hostile governments have access to weapons specifically designed to target military hospitals, field medical stations, and even civilian emergency rooms that treat military personnel, Dr. Wellington explained. The research your father sabotaged was continued after his defection, and some of those weapons have been used in recent conflicts. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the implications. Are you telling me that current American soldiers are being wounded by weapons my father helped create? We're telling you that current American soldiers are being protected by defensive measures your father made possible, Torres corrected. The information he provided allowed American intelligence to develop countermeasures for those weapons. Medical protocols you've been using at Walter Reed for decades are based on research that began with your father's intelligence. The specialized treatment procedures for certain types of chemical exposure that you learned during your advanced training, Dr. Wellington added. The protocols for handling patients with unusual shrapnel wounds. The security procedures for protecting classified medical information. All of that exists because your father's intelligence gave American agencies advance warning about the types of threats they needed to prepare for. Margaret realized that her entire nursing career had been connected to her father's defection in ways she had never understood. The specialized knowledge she had gained caring for patients with unusual injuries hadn't been random medical education. It had been preparation for treating victims of the specific types of weapons her father had helped identify and counter. How many other people are living with this kind of hidden protection? She asked. More than you might expect. Fewer than conspiracy theories would suggest, Torres replied. Families of defectors, former intelligence operatives, witnesses to classified events, people whose expertise makes them valuable targets. The intelligence community has an obligation to protect people whose knowledge or history puts them at risk. Dr. Wellington sat down across from Margaret. At Green Valley Estates, you would be living among people who understand exactly what it means to have a life shaped by classified events. People who have spent decades serving their country in ways that can never be publicly acknowledged. People whose knowledge and experience are still valuable to national security, but who need a safe environment to continue contributing. What will my life actually look like there? You would have a house or apartment of your own, furnished to your preferences. Access to all the amenities of a retirement community, plus some specialized services that most retirement communities don't offer. Medical facilities staffed by physicians who have security clearances. A library that includes classified research materials related to military medicine. Recreational facilities used by people who understand operational security requirements. Torres pulled out a tablet and showed Margaret photographs of Green Valley Estates. The community looked like an upscale retirement development, with well-maintained buildings, landscape common areas, and residents engaged in typical retirement activities. But looking closely, Margaret could see subtle signs of enhanced security. Guard stations that looked like information booths, landscaping that provided clear sight lines for surveillance, and recreational facilities that were positioned to allow defensive positioning if needed. You would also have opportunities to continue practicing medicine in a consulting capacity, Dr. Wellington continued. Medical research projects, training programs for military medical personnel, analysis of treatment protocols for classified injuries. The kind of work where your 3 decades of experience with military patients would be invaluable. Margaret studied the photographs, tried to imagine herself living in this strange hybrid of retirement community and secure facility. What about my sister in Oregon? My friends here in Washington? Maintaining those relationships would require some adjustments, Torres admitted. Communications would need to be monitored for security purposes, and visits would need to be arranged through proper channels. But those relationships wouldn't end. They would just need to be managed carefully. Managed how? Your sister would be briefed about general security requirements without being given specific details about the reasons for them. She would understand that your retirement involves certain privacy requirements, and she would agree to follow basic communication protocols. If she wanted to visit you, or if you wanted to visit her, security arrangements would be made to facilitate that safely. Margaret felt the weight of decisions that would affect not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she cared about. Her sister would have to agree to have her own life scrutinized and potentially restricted for the sake of Margaret's safety. Her friends would have to accept that their relationship with Margaret would never again be completely natural or spontaneous. What happens if I choose the alternative security plan? If I insist on staying in Washington and living independently? Torres closed the tablet and looked directly at Margaret. Then, you would have armed security personnel with you at all times. Your apartment would be modified with enhanced locks, security cameras, and communication equipment. Every person you interact with on a regular basis would be background checked and cleared for contact with you. Your daily routine would be planned and monitored by security professionals. That sounds like house arrest. It would be voluntary house arrest with the freedom to leave whenever you wanted, as long as you accepted that leaving would involve armed escorts and advanced security preparations for any destination. Dr. Wellington leaned forward. Margaret, I chose Green Valley Estates 5 years ago when I faced a similar decision. I had spent 25 years working on classified medical projects, and continuing that work while maintaining my safety required either complete isolation or life in a secure community. I chose the community, and I've never regretted it. What made you decide? The opportunity to continue practicing medicine in ways that matter, surrounded by colleagues who understand the importance and complexity of the work. At Green Valley Estates, I'm still a doctor. I still contribute to saving lives and advancing medical knowledge. But I do it in an environment where I don't have to pretend that my past doesn't exist or hide the fact that my expertise comes from experiences most physicians never have. Margaret walked back to her living room window and looked out at the street where she had lived for 2 decades. The familiar view was now populated with hidden security personnel and covert surveillance that she was only beginning to understand. Her independence had always been an illusion, but it had been a comfortable illusion that allowed her to feel like her life was her own choice. How long do I have to decide? We'd prefer to have your answer today, Torres replied. Every day you remain in an unsecured environment increases certain risks. But we understand that this is a major life decision, and we want you to feel confident about your choice. Can I see Green Valley Estates before I decide? Actually visit the place and meet some of the residents? Torres and Dr. Wellington exchanged another look. That can be arranged, Torres said. But the visit would need to happen today, and you would need to be prepared to stay there if you decide it's the right choice for you. You mean I wouldn't be able to come back to my apartment? Not to collect personal belongings or handle practical matters like closing accounts and forwarding mail. But returning to live here wouldn't be possible once you visited a classified facility like Green Valley Estates. Margaret realized she was facing a one-way decision. Once she learned more about the secure community, she would know too much about classified security operations to return to civilian life in Washington. Her choice wasn't really between two different retirement options. It was between accepting a truth that would change everything or continuing to live a fiction that was becoming harder to maintain. If I visit Green Valley Estates today and decide I don't want to stay, what happens then? Then we implement the alternative security plan immediately, Torres replied. Armed protection, secured housing, monitored communications, and restricted movement. Not as punishment, but as the only remaining way to ensure your safety once you've been fully briefed about the threats against you. Margaret sat down in her favorite chair and looked around the apartment she had called home for 20 years. Every object represented a memory, a choice, or a moment of comfort in what she had believed was a simple, honest life. Leaving all of it behind felt like erasing her own identity, but staying meant accepting restrictions that would make her apartment feel like a prison. Dr. Wellington, are you happy at Green Valley Estates? I'm happier there than I could be anywhere else, she replied without hesitation. I wake up every morning knowing that I can contribute to work that saves lives, surrounded by people who understand the sacrifices required for that kind of service. I have friends who share experiences similar to mine, medical facilities that meet any health need I might have, and security that allows me to focus on living rather than constantly watching over my shoulder. Do you miss your old life? Dr. Wellington smiled sadly. I miss the illusion that my old life was simple, but I don't miss the stress of pretending that my background and expertise were ordinary, or the loneliness of being unable to share my real experiences with anyone who could understand them. Margaret made her decision with the sudden clarity that comes when postponing a choice becomes more difficult than making it. I want to see Green Valley Estates today, and if it's what you say it is, I want to start my new life there as soon as possible. Torres nodded approvingly. I'll make the arrangements. We can leave within the hour. As Margaret began gathering personal items she wanted to take with her, she found herself looking at familiar objects with new understanding. The medical textbooks on her shelves included several volumes that she now realized contained information related to her father's intelligence contributions. The letters from former patients weren't just expressions of gratitude from soldiers she had helped heal. They were correspondence from intelligence operatives who had been part of her protection detail. Even her decision to become a nurse, which she had always attributed to a desire to help others, might have been influenced by guidance from people who understood that her father's background made her a natural fit for caring for wounded intelligence operatives. Dr. Wellington helped Margaret pack a suitcase, while Torres made phone calls arranging their travel to Arizona. As they prepared to leave, Margaret took one final look around the apartment that had been her home and sanctuary for 2 decades. Are you ready for this? Dr. Wellington asked gently. Margaret picked up her purse and the small suitcase containing items she couldn't bear to leave behind. I've been ready for this my entire life. I just didn't know it until yesterday. As they walked toward the door, Margaret realized that she was finally about to learn who she really was and what her life had actually meant. The truth would be difficult, but it would be real in ways that her comfortable fiction had never been. The woman who had ended her final nursing shift the night before was about to discover that her most important service to others was just beginning. The private jet waiting at Ronald Reagan National Airport looked like any corporate aircraft, But Margaret noticed details that suggested its true purpose. The windows were smaller and thicker than normal. The exterior showed no identifying numbers or logos, and the crew moved with the precise efficiency of military personnel operating under strict security protocols. This was not a luxury charter flight. This was classified transportation for classified passengers traveling to a classified destination. Commander Torres led Margaret and Dr. Wellington through a private terminal where their identification was checked against lists that existed only on secure computer systems. No tickets were issued, no boarding passes printed, and no questions asked about their destination or purpose of travel. Margaret found herself thinking that this was probably how her father had traveled during his defection 63 years earlier, though the technology had certainly improved. As their plane lifted off from Washington, Margaret watched the familiar landmarks of her former life shrink into miniature versions of themselves. The Potomac River looked like a silver ribbon, the Capitol building became a small white dome, and Walter Reed Medical Center disappeared entirely into the urban sprawl below. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known for a future that remained largely mysterious despite the briefings she had received. Dr. Wellington, who had taken the seat across from Margaret, seemed to understand her emotional state. The flight takes about 4 hours. That gives us time to talk about what you can expect when we arrive and what your first few days at Green Valley Estates will be like. How many people live there? Approximately 3,000 residents, plus support staff and security personnel. The community covers about 15 square miles of desert landscape, with residential areas, commercial facilities, medical buildings, and recreational spaces. To anyone flying overhead or driving past on public roads, it looks like a typical upscale retirement development. Torres, who was seated across the aisle working on a secure laptop, looked up from his screen. "Margaret, before we land, there are additional details about your father's intelligence work that you need to understand. Information that will help you appreciate why your protection has been maintained for so many decades." Margaret braced herself for more revelations. Every new piece of information about her father's past had been more complex and consequential than she had expected. What kind of details? The weapons research your father sabotaged in 1962 was part of a larger program that continued for decades after his defection. Some of the technology was eventually acquired by terrorist organizations, hostile governments, and criminal groups who adapted it for use against civilian targets. Dr. Wellington leaned forward. "The specialized medical knowledge you developed caring for patients with unusual injuries at Walter Reed wasn't just preparation for treating wounded soldiers. It was preparation for treating victims of attacks that might occur on American soil using weapons derived from your father's original intelligence." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the aircraft's air conditioning. "Are you saying that terrorist attacks in America have used weapons based on research my father worked on?" "We're saying that terrorist attacks in America have been prevented because your father's intelligence allowed American agencies to develop countermeasures for those weapons," Torres corrected. "But the threat remains active. The research he sabotaged was reconstructed using other sources, and the weapons technology he helped identify has evolved considerably since 1962, which means that people who want to acquire and use those weapons still consider your father's family a valuable target for retaliation," Dr. Wellington added. Eliminating his daughter wouldn't change the past, but it would send a message to other potential defectors that betraying certain organizations has consequences that last for generations. Margaret looked out the aircraft window at the landscape passing below. They were flying over mountains and desert, terrain that looked nothing like the familiar green hills and rivers of the Washington area. This physical distance from her former life felt symbolic of the emotional and psychological journey she was making from comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable truth. How many other families are living under this kind of long-term protection? "That information is classified even from me," Torres replied. "But I can tell you that protecting the families of intelligence assets is a significant and ongoing priority for multiple government agencies. The investment in time, money, and personnel required for your protection alone has been substantial over the past 60 years. What kind of investment? Dr. Wellington consulted a tablet she had pulled from her briefcase. Conservative estimate? $15 million in direct costs for security personnel, monitoring equipment, secure housing modifications, and operational expenses. That doesn't include the indirect costs of background checking people in your life, monitoring your communications, or coordinating your protection with other security operations. Margaret was stunned. $15 million to protect one retired nurse. $15 million to protect someone whose knowledge, connections, and family history represent a significant intelligence asset, Torres corrected. Your 3 decades of caring for wounded special operations personnel means you've seen faces, heard names, and witnessed injuries that could compromise ongoing classified missions if that information fell into enemy hands. But I never asked anyone's name or took notes about their injuries. You didn't need to ask names. You read charts, medical files, and treatment orders that contained identifying information. You witnessed conversations between patients and visitors who were part of classified operations. You observed healing patterns and treatment responses that could be used to identify specific individuals if cross-referenced with other intelligence. Dr. Wellington showed Margaret a chart on her tablet. This represents just some of the classified information you've been exposed to over the years. Patient identities, mission locations, injury patterns, treatment protocols, recovery timelines, and operational security procedures. In total, you possess more classified intelligence than many career intelligence officers. Margaret studied the chart, recognizing categories of information she had never thought of as sensitive or valuable. Details about how quickly certain types of wounds healed, which medications were most effective for specific injuries, and which patients had unusual reactions to standard treatments. Information she had filed away as professional experience was apparently a comprehensive database of intelligence about special operations personnel and their activities. This is why your retirement from Walter Reed required careful planning, Torres explained. You're not just a nurse leaving a job. You're an intelligence asset transitioning from active service to protected civilian status. As their plane began its descent toward Arizona, Margaret could see Green Valley Estates in the distance. From air, it looked exactly like Dr. Wellington had described, a well-planned retirement community with attractive buildings, landscaped grounds, and recreational facilities. But Margaret was beginning to understand that appearances in this new world she was entering were rarely what they seemed. The aircraft landed at a small private airstrip that appeared to serve the retirement community exclusively. No other planes were visible, and the only buildings were a modest terminal and several maintenance hangars. As they disembarked, Margaret noted that the airstrip was surrounded by desert for miles in every direction, making it impossible for unauthorized personnel to observe arrivals and departures without sophisticated surveillance equipment. A man in his 70s was waiting for them at the terminal. He moved with the upright bearing of former military, but his khaki pants and polo shirt suggested civilian retirement. His smile was warm and genuine as he approached their group. Margaret, I'd like you to meet Colonel James Patterson, retired Army intelligence. Jim has been a resident of Green Valley Estates for 8 years, and he knew your father. Patterson shook Margaret's hand firmly. It's an honor to finally meet Chun Wei-ming's daughter. Your father was a remarkable man who made contributions to American security that are still classified today. Margaret felt a surge of emotion at hearing someone speak about her father with knowledge of his real identity and accomplishments. You actually knew him? I was part of the intelligence team that debriefed your father after his defection. Spent 6 months working with him to understand the full scope of Chinese and Soviet weapons research he had been involved with. He talked about his wife and young daughter constantly during those sessions. You were always his primary concern, even when we were discussing intelligence matters that could affect thousands of lives. As they walked toward a vehicle that would take them into the community, Patterson continued sharing memories of Margaret's father. He was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, but also deeply principled, When he realized the weapons he was helping develop could be used against medical personnel, he didn't just object or request a transfer. He risked everything to make sure that research could never be completed. Dr. Wellington pointed out features of the community as they drove through the entrance gates. Security measures that looked like standard retirement community amenities. A gatehouse staffed by friendly attendants who were actually armed security personnel, landscaping that provided clear sight lines for surveillance cameras, and walking paths that were positioned to allow rapid response by security teams if needed. The residents here range in age from 55 to 92, Dr. Wellington explained. Former military officers, intelligence operatives, defense contractors, medical personnel who worked on classified projects, and family members who require protection for various reasons related to national security. They passed a group of people playing tennis on courts that Margaret noticed were positioned where armed security personnel could respond quickly if needed. An elderly couple was gardening in raised beds that were arranged to prevent anyone from approaching the residential areas without being observed. Children were playing in a playground that was carefully sited to be visible from multiple security positions. Children? Margaret asked. Grandchildren visiting their grandparents? Mostly, Patterson replied. But also some younger family members who require protection because of their parents' intelligence backgrounds. The community includes residents of all ages who share the common need for enhanced security. They stopped first at the medical facility, a modern building that looked like a high-end clinic, but was equipped with surgical suites, diagnostic equipment, and treatment capabilities that exceeded most civilian hospitals. Dr. Wellington led Margaret through corridors lined with offices where physicians, nurses, and medical researchers worked on projects that were clearly more complex than typical retirement community health care. This is where you would work if you choose to continue practicing medicine, Dr. Wellington explained, showing Margaret a treatment room equipped with medical technology she had never seen before. We provide health care for residents, but we also consult on medical matters related to ongoing intelligence operations. What kind of consulting? Analysis of injury patterns to help identify enemy weapons and tactics. Development of treatment protocols for injuries caused by new types of weapons. Training programs for medical personnel who will be working with wounded special operations personnel. Research into protective equipment and medical countermeasures for chemical and biological weapons. Margaret examined the equipment in the treatment room, recognizing some devices from her work at Walter Reed, but seeing others that were clearly more advanced than anything available in civilian medical facilities. The combination of familiar and unfamiliar technology represented the intersection of her nursing experience with capabilities she was only beginning to understand. Patterson led them to the community center, a large building that housed a library, computer facilities, meeting rooms, and recreational spaces. The library looked normal until Margaret noticed that significant sections were marked as requiring security clearances for access. Computer terminals were positioned to prevent unauthorized observation of screens, and meeting rooms were equipped with electronic countermeasures to prevent eavesdropping. The residents here have expertise in virtually every area related to national security, Patterson explained. Intelligence analysis, military strategy, weapons technology, communication security, counterterrorism, and many other specialties. Green Valley Estates isn't just a retirement community. It's a consulting resource for government agencies that need expertise from people who can't work in traditional office environments because of security concerns. They visited the residential areas, where Margaret saw houses and apartments that range from modest to luxurious, all designed to accommodate the preferences and physical needs of people in various stages of retirement. Gardens were carefully maintained, walkways were accessible for people with mobility limitations, and recreational facilities included everything from swimming pools to art studios to workshop spaces for residents who wanted to pursue hobbies. But Margaret also noticed that every residential building was positioned to provide mutual security coverage, that landscaping was designed to eliminate hiding places for potential threats, and that recreational areas were arranged to allow rapid evacuation if necessary. The community was beautiful and comfortable, but it was also a fortress disguised as a retirement development. As afternoon turned to evening, Margaret was introduced to residents who represented the full spectrum of intelligence community backgrounds. A former CIA operative who had spent 30 years working undercover in hostile countries. A retired Air Force general who had commanded nuclear weapons facilities during the Cold War. A defense contractor who had designed encryption systems still used to protect classified communications. A nurse who had worked in military hospitals in Iraq and Afghanistan, caring for wounded special operations personnel whose missions officially never happened. Each person Margaret met shared stories about their decision to move to Green Valley Estates, their adjustment to life in a secure community, and their continued contributions to national security through consulting work. The common themes were relief at being able to acknowledge their real backgrounds, satisfaction with continued meaningful work, and appreciation for living among people who understood the complexities and sacrifices of intelligence community service. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the nurse who had worked in Iraq and Afghanistan, invited Margaret to her apartment for dinner. The apartment was spacious and comfortable, decorated with personal items that reflected a life well lived and memories carefully preserved. But Margaret noticed security features that would be invisible to most visitors. Reinforced door frames, windows that were clearly bulletproof, and communication equipment that connected to community security systems. I moved here 3 years ago after my husband died, Dr. Martinez explained as she prepared dinner. I could have stayed in San Antonio near my children, but I would have needed around-the-clock security protection because of some of the patients I treated in combat zones. Here, I have security without feeling like I'm under house arrest. Do you miss your old life? I miss the illusion that my old life was normal. But I don't miss the stress of pretending that my experiences were ordinary or the isolation of being unable to share my real history with anyone who could understand it. After dinner, Dr. Martinez showed Margaret the medical research facility where she worked part-time. The building was unmarked and looked like office space from the outside, but the interior contained laboratories, computer systems, and research equipment that represented millions of dollars of investment in cutting-edge medical technology. We're working on treatment protocols for injuries caused by new types of weapons that haven't been used in combat yet, but that intelligence agencies know are being developed by hostile organizations, Dr. Martinez explained. The goal is to have medical countermeasures ready before American personnel are wounded by weapons we can't treat with existing protocols. Margaret studied research documents that described weapons she had never imagined and medical challenges that pushed the boundaries of current treatment capabilities. The work being done at Green Valley Estates wasn't just consulting on past experiences. It was preparation for future threats that most people couldn't imagine and hoped would never become reality. As they walked back to the community center, Margaret asked the question that had been troubling her since her arrival. Are the people here prisoners or residents? Dr. Martinez stopped walking and looked directly at Margaret. We're people whose knowledge and experience are too valuable and too dangerous to be left unprotected, but who have earned the right to live with dignity and purpose rather than in hiding. Green Valley Estates gives us the security we need and the freedom to continue contributing to something larger than ourselves. That evening, Margaret attended a community meeting in the center's main auditorium. About 200 residents were present, representing every demographic and background imaginable. The meeting covered typical retirement community business, budget discussions, activity planning, and facility maintenance issues. But Margaret noticed that discussions about security arrangements, communication protocols, and visitor policies were handled with a matter-of-fact efficiency of people who understood that these weren't ordinary community management issues. After the meeting, Colonel Patterson introduced Margaret to more residents, including several people who had worked with her father's intelligence in various capacities over the decades. Each person shared memories and insights that filled in details about her father's life and work that had been hidden from her for 60 years. Dr. Robert Shun, a retired Defense Intelligence Agency analyst who had no relation to Margaret despite sharing her family name, had spent 15 years working with intelligence derived from her father's defection. Your father's information prevented attacks on American medical facilities during the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and the early phases of the Iraq War. Medical personnel who are alive today, because of treatment protocols developed from your father's intelligence, include hundreds of soldiers who went on to save other lives. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the scope of her father's impact on events she had never known he was connected to. The quiet man who had worked in a restaurant kitchen and died when she was 12 had apparently influenced military medical practices for half a century after his death. As Margaret prepared for bed in the guest quarters where she would be staying while deciding about permanent residence, she reflected on everything she had learned and observed during her first day at Green Valley Estates. The community was everything Dr. Wellington had promised: secure but comfortable, purposeful but relaxed, honest about its residents' backgrounds while maintaining necessary operational security. But Margaret also realized that choosing to stay would mean accepting that she would never again live a completely ordinary life. Every friendship will be complicated by security considerations. Every trip outside the community would require coordination with protective personnel. Every phone call and email would be monitored for security purposes. Dr. Wellington knocked on Margaret's door as she was getting ready for sleep. "How are you feeling about everything you've seen today?" "Overwhelmed, but in a good way. Everyone here seems genuinely happy and fulfilled. The medical work is more interesting and important than anything I could do in civilian healthcare. The community itself is beautiful and well-designed. But you have concerns?" Margaret sat down on the bed and looked at Dr. Wellington, who had become both guide and advocate during this life-changing transition. "I'm concerned about losing the last traces of the person I used to be." Margaret Chun, ordinary nurse from Washington, wasn't real, but she was comfortable. "I'm not sure I'm ready to completely let go of that identity." Dr. Wellington sat down in the room's single chair. "Margaret, the person you used to be was never ordinary. You just didn't know how extraordinary you were. The Margaret Chun who cared for wounded special operations personnel, who kept classified information secure without even knowing it was classified, who earned the trust and respect of some of the most elite military personnel in the world. That person was real. This community will just allow you to be that person openly instead of hiding behind a fiction. What if I can't adapt to living here? What if I decide after a few months that this isn't right for me? Then, we help you develop alternative security arrangements that allow you to live elsewhere while maintaining your safety. But I should tell you that in the 5 years I've been here, I've only seen 2 people decide to leave. Both of them came back within a year because they found that living among people who didn't understand their backgrounds was more isolating than living with enhanced security." Margaret looked out the window of her guest room at the community she might soon call home. Lights are on in apartments and houses where people were settling into evening routines that looked normal but were shaped by experiences and knowledge that most civilians never acquired. The view was peaceful and domestic, but Margaret was learning to look beyond appearances to understand the complex realities that shaped this hidden world. "Dr. Wellington, if I stay here, will I be able to help people the way I did at Walter Reed?" "You'll be able to help people in ways you never could at Walter Reed. The medical work we do here doesn't just treat individual patients. It develops capabilities that protect thousands of people who serve in dangerous places doing dangerous work. Your experience caring for wounded special operations personnel makes you uniquely qualified to contribute to that kind of impact." Margaret made her decision with the same clarity that had guided her choice to visit Green Valley Estates in the first place. "I want to stay. I want to learn everything I can about my father's real life and work. I want to continue practicing medicine in ways that matter. And I want to finally understand who I really am instead of living with comfortable fictions." Dr. Wellington smiled with genuine warmth. "Welcome home, Margaret. Tomorrow we'll start the process of helping you build the life you were always meant to have." As Margaret finally prepared for sleep, she realized that her journey was just beginning. Everything she had learned about her father, her past, and her protected life had been preparation for understanding her role in a world she was only starting to discover. The retired nurse who had ended her final shift at Walter Reed 3 days earlier was becoming someone new, a willing participant in the complex, dangerous, and critically important work of protecting American national security. Outside her window, the lights of Green Valley Estates twinkled in the desert darkness, representing a community of people who had chosen truth over comfort, purpose over ease, and service over safety. Margaret was ready to join them. Margaret's first week at Green Valley Estates unfolded like a carefully orchestrated revelation, each day bringing new understanding about her father's legacy and her own role in the intelligence community's extended family. The community operated on multiple levels simultaneously: the visible level of a comfortable retirement development and the hidden level of a highly sophisticated intelligence consultation facility where some of America's most experienced operatives continued serving their country. Dr. Wellington had arranged for Margaret to shadow different residents during their daily activities, providing her with a comprehensive view of how life functioned in this unique environment. Her first assignment was spending the morning with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a former Army psychiatrist who now consulted on psychological evaluation protocols for personnel assigned to classified operations. Dr. Vasquez's office was located in the medical building, but her work extended far beyond traditional psychiatric care. She conducted video conferences with military psychologists stationed around the world, reviewed evaluation procedures for special operations candidates, and developed mental health treatment protocols for personnel returning from missions that officially never happened. The psychological challenges faced by intelligence operatives and special operations personnel are different from those experienced by regular military, Dr. Vasquez explained as she reviewed files on her secure computer system. Traditional PTSD treatment assumes that patients can discuss their traumatic experiences with therapists and support groups. But when your trauma is classified, standard therapeutic approaches become problematic. Margaret observed as Dr. Vasquez conducted a video consultation with a military psychologist at an undisclosed overseas location. The conversation involved developing treatment plans for personnel who had been exposed to chemical weapons during a mission that couldn't be acknowledged publicly. The challenge was providing effective mental health care while maintaining operational security about the circumstances that had caused the psychological trauma. This is the kind of work you could become involved with, Dr. Vasquez told Margaret during a break between consultations. Your experience caring for wounded special operations personnel gives you insights into how psychological and physical trauma interact in ways that most medical professionals never observe. Margaret was intrigued by the possibility of expanding her nursing expertise in psychological care. Would that require additional training? Specialized training, yes, but not traditional academic programs. The psychological challenges we address here don't exist in civilian textbooks. Our training programs are developed by people who have lived through the experiences we're trying to treat. That afternoon, Margaret worked with Colonel Richard Hayes, a former Air Force intelligence officer who now managed the community's information security systems. His job involved ensuring that the thousands of classified documents, computer files, and communication records stored at Green Valley Estates remain secure from foreign intelligence agencies, criminal organizations, and domestic groups that might want access to sensitive information. Colonel Hayes showed Margaret the computer center where residents could access classified databases, communicate with former colleagues still on active duty, and contribute to ongoing intelligence analysis projects. The facility looked like a modern office environment, but Margaret noticed security features that went far beyond typical computer labs. Biometric access controls, electromagnetic shielding to prevent electronic eavesdropping, and workstations that were physically isolated from any external communication networks. Every resident here has access to classified information systems appropriate to their clearance level and need to know, Colonel Hayes explained. We maintain active security clearances for people who continue consulting on government projects, and we provide secure communication capabilities for people who need to coordinate with agencies in Washington. Margaret watched residents working at computer terminals, analyzing intelligence reports, preparing briefing documents, and participating in secure video conferences with government officials. The level of ongoing engagement with national security operations was far greater than she had expected. This wasn't just a retirement community for former intelligence personnel. It was an active intelligence facility disguised as a civilian development. How much of the work done here directly affects current operations? She asked. More than you might expect. Last month, analysis performed by residents of this community contributed to stopping a terrorist attack in Europe, identifying a foreign spy network operating in the United States, and developing countermeasures for a new type of explosive device that hostile groups were planning to use against American targets. Margaret realized that the people she was living among weren't just retired professionals sharing war stories. They were active participants in ongoing intelligence operations whose work continued to save lives and protect American interests around the world. Her third day included time with Dr. Michael Torres, Commander Torres's father, who worked in the community's medical research laboratory. The elder Dr. Torres was a biochemist who had spent 40 years developing antidotes and treatments for chemical and biological weapons. His current work involved analyzing intelligence about new types of weapons being developed by hostile organizations and creating medical countermeasures before those weapons could be used against American personnel. The advantage of working here is access to intelligence about threats that haven't become public yet, Dr. Torres explained as he showed Margaret laboratory equipment capable of synthesizing experimental medications. We could develop treatments for weapons that enemy organizations are still testing, which means our military medical personnel are prepared for threats they might encounter in the field. Margaret observed Dr. Torres working with chemical samples that had been acquired through intelligence operations she wasn't authorized to know details about. The goal was understanding how new types of chemical weapons affected human physiology and developing treatment protocols that could be implemented by military medical personnel who might encounter victims of those weapons. This research is directly related to your father's intelligence from 1962, Dr. Torres continued. Some of the weapons technology he helped us understand has evolved into threats we're still dealing with today. Your nursing experience treating unusual injury patterns makes you valuable for this kind of research because you understand how theoretical medical challenges translate into practical treatment requirements. By her fourth day, Margaret had been introduced to enough residents and projects to understand that Green Valley Estates was essentially a small city populated entirely by people whose knowledge and experience were considered national security assets. The community provided them with security, comfortable living conditions, and opportunities to continue contributing to intelligence operations while maintaining the fiction that they were simply retirees enjoying their golden years in the Arizona desert. Dr. Wellington arranged for Margaret to attend her first classified briefing, held in a conference room that was electronically shielded to prevent any possibility of eavesdropping. The briefing covered current threats against former intelligence personnel and their families, including recent attempts by foreign agencies to locate and eliminate American intelligence assets living under protected identities. The threats your father's family faces aren't historical curiosities, explained the briefing officer, a woman whose title and agency affiliation were never mentioned. Chinese and Russian intelligence agencies maintain active files on families of defectors going back decades. Eliminating those family members serves both revenge and deterrence purposes. Margaret learned that 3 other families of Cold War-era defectors had been targeted for assassination within the past 2 years. In one case, the attack had been prevented by protective security measures. In another case, the family had been successfully relocated to secure facilities before the attack could be carried out. In the third case, 2 family members had been killed before American intelligence agencies could intervene. Your decision to move to Green Valley Estates was made at exactly the right time, the briefing officer continued. Intelligence sources indicate that your location in Washington had been identified by hostile agencies, and preparations were being made for an operation against you. Margaret felt chilled by the realization that her retirement from Walter Reed had been motivated as much by immediate threat as by her desire to end her nursing career. The comfortable fiction that she was simply choosing a new lifestyle was replaced by the understanding that she was fleeing from people who wanted her dead, because of secrets her father had shared with American intelligence 63 years earlier. The briefing included photographs of surveillance activities that had been conducted around her Washington apartment building, her car, and even her favorite grocery store. Foreign intelligence operatives had been watching her daily routines, identifying patterns that could be exploited for assassination attempts. Her protection detail had been monitoring the surveillance and preparing countermeasures, but the situation had been escalating toward a confrontation that could have endangered innocent civilians. Moving you to Green Valley Estates eliminated the immediate threat while providing long-term security in an environment where you can continue contributing to national security operations, the briefing officer concluded. Your knowledge and experience are too valuable to lose, and your father,